Danielle Hargrove sat across a black lacquer table in a private dining room in Hanamdong, her hands folded so tightly her knuckles had gone pale. The man across from her hadn't touched his tea. He hadn't touched anything since she walked in. Baek Joon-seo studied her, the way a man studies a contract he already knows he's going to sign, looking for the one clause that might cost him later. Then he spoke. 5 words, flat and quiet. "You don't want to be here." It wasn't a question. Danielle opened her mouth to answer, and found she had nothing rehearsed that fit. 6 months ago she had been a wife in Charleston, blamed for a silence that was never hers to carry. 3 weeks ago she had been a daughter, sold across an ocean by the 2 people who were supposed to protect her. Tonight she was a stranger in a stranger's house, sitting across from a man soul feared by name alone, a man who needed a mother for 3 children who had already buried one. Neither of them wanted love, but something about the way he'd said it, no smile, no performance, just the truth laid flat on the table, felt more honest than anything her own family had given her in 6 years. The screen cut to black before he could say another word. Before we go further, if this story is already pulling you in, take 2 seconds to hit subscribe and tap that like button. I promise you, what happens next in this house will be worth every minute you spend with us tonight. 6 months earlier, Danielle sat at the head of a long mahogany table in Charleston, South Carolina, at a dinner she thought was ordinary. Eleanor Devereaux, her mother-in-law, was mid-sentence about a friend's new grandbaby when she turned that same tired smile on Danielle. "You know, dear, at your age, most women already have 2 or 3 running around the yard." Eleanor sipped her wine like she hadn't just thrown a knife across the table. "I do hope you and Marcus aren't waiting too long." Danielle kept her face still. She had gotten good at that. 6 years of fertility clinics, 6 years of doctors speaking about her body like it was a machine with a broken part, 6 years of Marcus sitting beside her at appointments and saying nothing when the specialist suggested testing him too. "The problem isn't me," he always said, like a man guarding a secret instead of a marriage. He said nothing now either. He let his mother's comments sit in the air and reached for his glass instead of his wife's hand. Danielle didn't know yet that he had already made his decision. She didn't know that the dinner itself was the stage, and she was the only one at the table who hadn't read the script. Marcus set down his fork. "I think it's time we talked about this properly," he said, loud enough for the whole table to hear. "I'm filing for divorce. We need an heir, Danielle. You understand." The room went quiet, the way a room goes quiet, right before something breaks. No apology followed. No explanation beyond those 11 words. Eleanor's face arranged itself into something that almost looked like sympathy, but her eyes were already calculating who would get the beach house. Danielle stood, smoothed her dress with hands that were shaking, and walked out of the dining room alone. Nobody followed her. In the hallway, she heard one of the cousins murmur to another, low enough to think she couldn't hear, "Beautiful tree. Shame it never bears fruit." By the following week, the Charleston papers had turned her into a headline, "The wife who couldn't give her husband a child." Photos of Marcus's new girlfriend, smiling, glowing, already expecting, the tabloids whispered, ran beside old wedding photos of Danielle in her white dress, captioned like an obituary for a marriage that had died of her failure. Not one reporter asked why nobody had checked whether the problem was ever hers to begin with. She drove home to Savannah expecting her mother's arms around her. What she got instead was a folder waiting on the kitchen table, and her father pacing behind it like a man counting down a clock only he could hear. "Your father's business is in trouble," Carletta said, before Danielle had even set down her bags. No hug, no "how are you?" Just a folder and a face already hardened for the conversation ahead. Reginald's logistics company had been drowning under debt for years, kept alive by loans from a man named Curtis Landry, the kind of man whose name people in Savannah only said in a lower voice. The payments had come due. Landry didn't do extensions. "I'm your daughter," Danielle said, standing in the kitchen where she'd once done homework as a little girl. "Doesn't that matter?" Carletta didn't answer. She just slid the folder an inch closer across the table. Inside was a photograph of a man Danielle had never seen before. Baek Joon-seo, Seoul, South Korea. The matchmaker's letter attached to it read like a business prospectus. Successful, respected, in need of a wife to care for his 3 children. A bride price large enough to erase every dollar Reginald owed Curtis Landry, wired the moment the papers were signed. "I'm not livestock," Danielle said, pushing the folder back. Her parents signed it anyway. 48 hours later, she was standing at Hartsfield Jackson with 2 suitcases and a stranger's name waiting for her on the other side of the world. Mrs. Baek. If you've ever had someone decide your worth for you, stick around, because Danielle is about to learn just how far from ordinary this marriage really is. Drop a comment below and tell me, could you forgive a parent who sold you out to save themselves? On the 14-hour flight to Incheon, Danielle did the only thing she had left. She researched the man she now belonged to. What she found didn't comfort her. Photographs of Baek Joon-seo always showed him alone, one step ahead of every camera, his face unreadable in every frame. Business articles hinted at contracts that moved faster than they should, at rivals who quietly disappeared from headlines rather than courtrooms. One name kept surfacing beside his Choi Dae-sung, a man described only as close to Baek, never anything more specific, which somehow said everything. She learned he was a widower. His wife had died 3 years earlier in a car accident on a bridge over the Han River, leaving him alone with 7-year-old triplets. She learned that 12 nannies had come through that house in 2 years, and none of them had lasted. She had no money of her own now, no visa that didn't run through his name, nowhere on this earth to run to even if she wanted to. Somewhere over the Pacific, Danielle stopped crying and started preparing instead. The house in Hanamdong was not what she expected. It didn't feel like wealth. It felt like a museum that had stopped letting anyone touch the exhibits. Marble floors so cold they seemed to hum. Hallways lined with photographs of a woman who was clearly no longer alive. A silence so total it had its own weight. That was where they finally sat down together. The negotiation the cold open had only shown the first half of. Joon-seo laid out his terms the way he likely laid out every deal that mattered to him. No wasted words. No romance expected. Separate rooms. She would care for the children and maintain appearances in public. In return, she would have safety, comfort, and his protection, absolute and unshakable. Danielle didn't nod along, like a woman grateful for scraps. "If I'm doing this," she said, "I want respect. A real trial period, 6 months, with an exit clause I control. Not you, me." For the first time since she'd landed, something shifted behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly. Recognition, maybe, of a woman who hadn't come to be managed. "Agreed," he said, and extended his hand. Neither of them smiled when they shook on it, but something had been decided in that handshake that went beyond the paperwork, a small, private admission that this stranger sitting across from him might not be someone to survive, but someone to actually see. "We're just getting started, and I promise you, what Danielle finds inside this house, and inside these 3 children who have already lost one mother, is going to break your heart before it puts it back together. If this story has you already invested, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss where this goes." The wedding, if it could be called that, took 11 minutes at a courthouse in Gangnam. No white dress, no flowers, just signatures and a clerk who barely looked up. Reginald and Carletta had flown in for it, beaming with a relief that turned Danielle's stomach. Relief that had nothing to do with her happiness and everything to do with a debt now paid. That same afternoon, she was moved into the Baek estate for good. The head housekeeper, a stern woman named Mrs. O, walked her through the halls with a clipped efficiency that didn't invite questions, though she offered one piece of information without being asked. The last one who tried to be their mother, Mrs. O said, not unkindly, lasted 3 days. That night, lying awake in a room that still smelled faintly of someone else's perfume, Danielle heard small footsteps stop outside her door. They didn't knock, they didn't come in. They just stood there for a long moment, listening, before padding away down the cold marble hall. She understood, even before she met them in the morning, that the 3 children of this house were already watching her, deciding, the way children who have already lost everything once always do, whether she was worth the risk of losing again. Ji-ho stood the farthest from her when Joon-seo finally brought all 3 children into the sitting room the next morning, arms crossed, jaw set, every inch the eldest guarding what was left of his family. Seon studied Danielle with a sharpness far older than 7, already testing, already looking for the crack. And Taemin, the youngest, stayed half hidden behind his brother, his eyes darting more toward his siblings than toward the woman he'd been told to call something close to family. Joon-seo watched them for a long moment before he spoke, and when he did, it wasn't to the children, it was to her. "I think," he said quietly, "if anyone can reach them, it's someone who understands what it's like to be abandoned." Danielle felt the words land somewhere she hadn't expected. Nobody in Charleston had ever spoken to her like that, like her pain was a qualification instead of a flaw. That night, she found mud packed into her shoes and her books rearranged on the shelf, small, silent declarations of war from children who had learned that love always left eventually. She said nothing. She simply cleaned her shoes, reshelved her books, and showed up again the next morning like nothing had happened. Mrs. O watched it happen from the doorway and said nothing either, but something in her expression had already begun to change. If Danielle can win over 3 children who've already learned not to trust anyone, and a man who hasn't let himself feel anything in 3 years, this is going to be a story you won't forget. I've got so much more coming. The gala, the scandal that finally exposes the truth back in Charleston, and the moment one of these children finally calls her something she never expected to hear again. Make sure you're subscribed and your notifications are on, because you do not want to miss what happens next. And while you wait, drop a comment below. Who do you think breaks first, Ji-ho or Danielle? The days after that first meeting with the triplets folded into weeks, and each one chipped a little more off the walls Danielle had walked into. She found Taemin first, in the small walled garden behind the east wing, sitting alone beside a row of untended flower beds. He didn't run when she sat down beside him. That alone felt like progress. "My grandmother had a garden like this," Danielle said, not looking at him, just looking at the dirt. Tomatoes that never grew right, and roses that somehow always did. Taemin was quiet for a long time. Then, so softly she almost missed it, "My mom used to grow flowers here. Before." It was the first sentence he had offered her without being asked. Danielle kept her voice even, careful not to spook something so fragile. "Would you show me which ones were hers?" He pointed to a patch of soil gone wild with weeds, and for the next hour they pulled them out together, saying almost nothing, saying everything. When she finally stood to go back inside, Taemin reached out and let his small hand rest against her sleeve. "Maybe," he whispered, so quiet the wind nearly took it, "you could stay." Seon's turn came differently. A phone call from the school nurse, a fever of 102, and Joon-seo stuck in a meeting he couldn't leave. Danielle didn't wait for permission. She was in the car within minutes. She found Seon curled small on the nurse's cot, cheeks flushed, trying very hard not to cry in front of a stranger. But Danielle wasn't quite a stranger anymore, and something about that broke the last of the girl's composure. She said she'd always be there, Seon said between shaking breaths, not needing to explain who she was. That's what moms are supposed to say, and then she just wasn't. Danielle pulled her into her arms without asking, and for the first time, Seon let herself be held. Jiho was the last holdout, and he made sure she knew it. He cornered her in the hallway outside his room one evening, arms crossed, voice low and sharp for a boy his age. "Stay away from my brother," he said. "None of us need you." Danielle didn't flinch, and she didn't retreat. "I know you don't need me," she said quietly, "but I'm not going anywhere, Jiho, not because someone paid for me to stay, because I'm choosing to." He said nothing back, but he didn't slam the door either, and later, Mrs. O would tell her that was the longest conversation Jiho had allowed with anyone since his mother died. Joon-seo noticed all of it in his own quiet way. He found her in the hallway one night and said, without preamble, "You've lasted a week. That's a record." It wasn't warm, but it wasn't nothing either. A few days later, he found her again, this time in his office doorway. "There's a charity gala Friday," he said. "You'll need to attend with me. Seoul Society will be watching closely. I need to know you can handle it." It wasn't a question, but she answered like it was. "I can handle it. Before we get to that gala, because trust me, it's about to change everything. If you're enjoying this story, take a second and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this story reach more people who need to hear it. Now, back to Seoul." The stylist spent 2 hours on her before Joon-seo ever saw the result. When Danielle stepped out in deep emerald silk, hair swept back, he said nothing at first, just looked at her the way a man looks at something he hadn't let himself expect. The gala itself was a battlefield disguised as a ballroom. Whispers followed her through the crowd. "The Barren wife," someone murmured behind a champagne flute, not bothering to lower their voice enough. Danielle kept her chin level and her hand steady on Joon-seo's arm. Then, across the room, a familiar face. Marcus Devereaux, in Seoul on business, his new fiancée glittering on his arm like a trophy he'd upgraded to. He crossed the room with a smile that had once made Danielle's stomach turn with hope, and now only turned it with disgust. "Danielle," Marcus said, feigning warmth. "You look well. Married again so soon. Didn't waste any time, did you?" The room seemed to lean in, hungry for her humiliation. But before Danielle could answer, Joon-seo stepped forward, and the temperature of the entire ballroom seemed to drop. "I don't believe we've met," he said to Marcus, his voice low, controlled and colder than anything Danielle had heard from him yet. "But let me be clear about something. My wife is not a subject for your entertainment. Anyone who disrespects her disrespects me. I'd think carefully about which one of those you'd prefer to survive." Marcus's smile died on his face. He mumbled something about needing another drink, and retreated, his fiancée trailing after him, confused and suddenly very small. The car ride home was silent for a long time. Then Joon-seo spoke, staring straight ahead. "I meant what I said in there." "I know," Danielle said. "I don't say things I don't mean." For the first time since Incheon, Danielle let herself really look at him. Not the feared businessman, not the cold stranger who'd signed a contract with her, but a man who had just stood in a room full of Seoul's most powerful people and chosen, without hesitation, to protect her. A few weeks later, he found her in the small sitting room where she liked to read in the evenings, 2 cups of tea already poured before she'd even sat down. "This stopped being just an arrangement for me," Joon-seo said, not looking up from his cup. "I need you to know that, whatever you decide to do with it, stay, go, 6 months, 6 years, I needed you to know." Danielle set her own cup down carefully, steadying her hands. "I'm starting to care too," she admitted. "About you, about the children, more than I ever expected to." Neither of them moved to close the distance between them that night, but something had shifted, quietly, permanently, in the room. 3 months slid by the way healing does, not in a straight line, but in small, stubborn steps. Tae-min took to sitting beside her at every single meal, close enough that their shoulders touched. Seon started bringing her homework to the kitchen table instead of hiding in her room. Ji-ho remained the holdout, still testing, still guarded, but the hostility had worn down into something closer to wary tolerance. It was on the staircase one evening that Ji-ho finally cracked open, just slightly. Danielle found him sitting on the middle step, a photograph in his hands, his mother, laughing, younger than Danielle had ever seen her in the hallway portraits. "I don't remember her voice anymore," Ji-ho said, not looking up. "I try, and I can't. Is that wrong?" Danielle sat down beside him, careful not to reach for the photo. "It's not wrong," she said. "It just means it's been long enough that grief stopped being sharp and started being quiet. That doesn't mean you loved her less." Ji-ho didn't answer, but he didn't get up and leave either. He sat there beside her until the hallway lights dimmed for the night and something small and stubborn in his chest finally, quietly, let go. It happened on an ordinary night, over an ordinary dinner, when the conversation drifted somewhere neither of them had planned. Joon-seo talked, for the first time, about the guilt of surviving his wife. Danielle talked, for the first time, about 6 years of being told her body had failed at the one job that mattered. "You were never broken," Joon-seo said quietly. "You were just standing next to a man who couldn't admit he was." Danielle felt something crack open in her chest, gentle instead of painful for once. Joon-seo reached across the table and, slow and careful, like a man handling something he was terrified of breaking, kissed her. Neither of them apologized when it ended. We are getting so close to the part of this story where everything Danielle lost gets handed back to her, with interest. If this story has meant something to you tonight, drop a comment and let me know which moment hit you hardest so far. It genuinely means the world to see your reactions. The news broke on a Tuesday morning, splashed across every Charleston outlet Danielle used to dread. Marcus's engagement had collapsed. His new fiancée, pregnant with another man's child before the wedding even happened, had exposed something far bigger on her way out the door. Medical records, quietly bribed and altered years earlier, revealing the truth Marcus had buried at Danielle's expense. He had been the one who couldn't have children. He always had been. Joon-seo read the article on his tablet in complete silence, his jaw tightening by degrees. When he finally looked up, his voice was calm in a way that was somehow more frightening than shouting would have been. "When I'm furious," he said quietly, "I get very calm." He set the tablet down. "Destroy them." "No," Danielle said, surprising them both. "I don't want revenge, Joon-seo. I just want the truth known. That's all I ever wanted." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded once, understanding exactly the kind of woman he had married. By the end of the week, the truth was everywhere. Danielle's name finally, publicly, cleared of a lie she'd carried for 6 years. That evening, all 3 children found her in the sitting room, and for the first time, all 3 of them, Tae-min, Se-yeon, and even Ji-ho, moved to comfort her at once. A small unified wall of family standing between her and a past that no longer had any power over her. The peace didn't last long. A week later, Reginald and Carletta arrived unannounced at the estate gates, all smiles and rehearsed concern. "We just wanted to see how you're settling in," Carletta said, glancing around the marble foyer with an appraising eye that gave away exactly why they'd really come. It took less than 10 minutes for the truth to surface. Reginald needed capital for the business again. Carletta mentioned, almost as an afterthought, a cousin's tuition that had gotten away from them. Danielle felt something inside her go very still and very clear. "Tell me one thing," she said. "One single thing you've ever done that was actually for me. Not for the business, not for appearances, for me." Silence stretched across the foyer, long and damning. "That's what I thought," Danielle said, and for the first time in her life, she was the one who asked them to leave. What she didn't know was that all 3 children had been watching from the top of the staircase the entire time. When their footsteps finally came down to meet her, Ji-ho spoke first, his voice unsteady in a way she'd never heard from him. "I don't want to be scared anymore," he said. "Can I call you Mom?" Danielle sank to her knees, right there in the foyer, and pulled all three of them into her arms at once, and for the first time since she'd stepped off that plane in Incheon, the cold marble house finally felt like something worth calling home. That night, in the quiet of her room, Joon-seo found her by the window. "We build a real marriage," he said, taking her hand. "Not because we have to, because we want to." "I love you," Danielle said, no hedging left in her voice at all. "I love you too," he answered. "I have for a while now." 2 years later, the garden behind the east wing bloomed wild and full, tended by 3 children who had grown taller, louder, and lighter than the ones who once watched Danielle from the top of a staircase, waiting to be abandoned again. At dinner one evening, Danielle set down her fork and looked around the table at her family, the family that had chosen her and the one she had, against every odd, chosen right back. "I'm pregnant," she said. Taemin whooped with pure joy. Seon declared immediately that she'd be the best big sister in Seoul. Ji-ho, quieter than his siblings but no less certain, simply said, "Then I'm happy too," and reached for Danielle's hand under the table. Later that night, Joon-seo led her out to the garden where he'd quietly planted a new row of flowers beside his late wife's, not replacing anything, just growing something new beside it. He remembered, he told her, every single story she'd ever told him about her grandmother's garden back in Savannah. Family, Danielle had come to understand, was never really about who you were born to. It was about who chose you and who stayed. "I was lost," she said softly, looking around at the family that had once been strangers and was now everything. "Then I was found, and now I'm home." If this story moved you tonight, that's exactly why I make them. Please subscribe and turn on your notifications so you never miss a story like this one, and tell me in the comments which character's journey touched you the most. Someone out there needs to hear it. Thank you for staying with me until the very end.